Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is simple: to take the massive, overwhelming stack of information you have gathered, the articles, the research, the notes, and distill it into profound, actionable insight.
And today we are wrestling with a figure who is perhaps the most turbulent, revolutionary, and deeply contradictory mind of the entire Enlightenment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Rousseau, born in 1712 and passing in 1778, is truly a world changer. His philosophical shadow stretches over, pretty much everything: modern political structure, education theory, literature, even our psychological understanding of the self.
It really does. And what makes this deep dive so compelling is the vast contradiction in his life. He was, simultaneously hailed across Europe as a prophet of freedom, democracy, and natural simplicity. And yet condemned as an antichrist, a utopian fool, and later a philosophical architect of totalitarianism.
Our sources today are extensive, covering the entirety of his, chaotic personal journey, the uncompromising axioms of his political philosophy, and the seismic legacy he left behind.
So we're really seeking to understand how the man who championed the moral simplicity of humanity and basically invented the modern, intensely honest autobiography, his Confessions.
How that same man lived a life marked by such profound paranoia, personal failure, and just continuous bitter conflict. It's a huge, messy question.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at his roots. Rousseau begins with a really powerful identity. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, citizen of Geneva. He was born in this Protestant city-state, and that Genevan identity and the Republican spirit he associated with it, it really defined his political outlook from the very beginning.
It's vital to grasp the context of Geneva at the time. It was, in theory, a republic where the citizens, the native-born, property-owning, middle-class males, which included his family, had voting rights.
Right. And he was incredibly proud of this. He was constantly signing his books with that title.
He was. But the political reality was, a lot more complex.
Complex how?
Despite the veneer of republicanism, the city was actually run by a wealthy elite, an oligarchy of a few hundred families. They called it the Council of 200, and they delegated daily power to an even smaller group, the small Council of 25.
So his family, the watchmakers, they were part of this dissenting group, right?
Yeah.
Resisting the ruling class.
Exactly. They were tradespeople who are constantly fighting for their citizen rights to be taken seriously. And this experience gave him a foundational, almost innate understanding of the tension between, theoretical freedom and actual political corruption.
And his father, Isaac, played a critical role in shaping this view. Isaac was a watchmaker, but in Geneva, that was a really respected profession.
Oh, absolutely. Rousseau explicitly contrasted the Genevan watchmaker, who he called a man who can be introduced anywhere, with the much lower status of artisans in a place like Paris. This respect for skilled, independent labor is deeply integrated into his later critique of useless luxury.
But the influence wasn't just political, was it? It was literary and intensely emotional. You've got these descriptions of the foundational reading experiences they share.
Yes, he inherited his deceased mother's collection of escapist sentimental romances, books like L'Estray, and he said they would read these melodramatic stories together all night long, sometimes until the sun came up.
Reading escapist fantasy until dawn with his father? That sounds completely immersive.
It was, and he later claimed that these intense, often emotionally draining sessions instilled in him a set of bizarre and romantic notions of human life that he, never truly shook off. It created this deep sensitivity, this internal melodrama that would later fuel both his writing and his paranoia.
But then, almost immediately, they shifted gears, and they're diving into ancient and modern classics, specifically Plutarch's Lives.
Right, and he saw these heroic biographies as another kind of novel, but one that instilled a profound free and republican spirit.
So it's this wild juxtaposition, escapist, sentimental romance on one hand, and stoic republican virtue on the other. That's a fascinating mix.
A fascinating mix, yes, but stability was definitely not part of the recipe. His mother, Suzanne, died of puerperal fever just 9 days after his birth, which he bitterly referred to as the first of my misfortunes.
And then his father leaves.
When he was only 10, his father fled Geneva to avoid a legal dispute after he was caught poaching. Isaac remarried and just left Jean-Jacques in the care of relatives. So the young Rousseau was already a child of profound loss.
And the instability just got worse. He was apprenticed to a brutal engraver, and at 15 ran away entirely after returning to the city gates too late and finding himself locked out. He was completely alone.
And that flight led him to adjoining Savoy and to Françoise Louise de Warren's. She was a 29-year-old noblewoman separated from her husband and just a pivotal figure in his life. He called her Maman.
And Madame de Warens was working essentially as a professional lay proselytizer, right, paid by the King of Piedmont to help convert Protestants to Catholicism.
Precisely. So Rousseau converts, which meant he automatically forfeited his precious Genevan citizenship, though he did later reverse the conversion to Calvinism to regain his rights.
Was that shift just opportunistic?
Not entirely. It was partly philosophical. Both he and Madame de Warens were reacting against the Calvinist doctrine that insisted upon the total depravity of man. They found that idea repugnant and aligned instead with a more optimistic, nature-based view of human morality.
And their relationship.
Yeah.
It evolved drastically. After living together for years, when Rousseau turned 20, she took him as her lover.
And it was complicated because she was already intimately involved with her house steward, creating this famous ménage à trois. He described her as the greatest love of his life, even though he later admitted he found the sexual element confusing and uncomfortable.
So that pattern of emotional intensity coupled with personal awkwardness, it really tracks throughout his life.
It does. And this is also a period of intense, though still undirected, autodidactic study. He focused seriously on philosophy, mathematics, and critically, music. By 1742, armed with this intellectual ambition, he moved to Paris with a bold idea.
The new system of musical notation.
A new system of numbered musical notation compatible with typography, which he planned to present to the Académie des Sciences.
So did the Academy embrace this young genius?
They rejected it. They praised his mastery of the subject, but they deemed the system impractical for widespread use. And this bureaucratic rejection, being told that his brilliant, rigorous system couldn't work in the complex, organized world of Parisian institutions, that seems to have hit him hard, and it really hardened his burgeoning distrust of established systems.
And that distrust was cemented during his brief stint as secretary to the French ambassador in Venice.
Right. From 1743 to 1744. He experienced bureaucracy firsthand, noting how his employer paid his wages irregularly, sometimes delaying them for a year. He developed a permanent, profound distrust of official government organs, believing they were intrinsically corrupt and inefficient.
The only good thing to come out of Venice then was the opera.
The only lasting positive outcome, yes. He fell deeply in love with Italian opera's focus on melody, or what he called natural expression, over the rigid, complex harmonies of traditional French music. And this artistic preference would later fuel his involvement in the famous Chorale des Bouffons, the Choral of the Comedians, and serve as an early philosophical precursor to Romanticism.
Now, we have to confront the dark secret, the gaping, irreconcilable contradiction that defines Rousseau the man versus Rousseau the theorist. After returning to Paris, he partnered with Thérèse Levasseur, a seamstress.
A seamstress who supported her large, difficult family, and our sources indicate that she bore him up to 5 children over several years.
And according to his own shocking admission in the Confessions,
he convinced her to give every single one of those newborns up to the Paris Foundling Hospital.
Wait. The man who would go on to write the most influential text on child-centered education in the Western world, Émile, abandoned 5 of his own children. How does he possibly justify that in his Confessions?
The justification is layered and utterly self-serving. Initially, he claims poverty, that he wasn't rich enough to raise them well. But the deeper, more damning reason he offered was his fear that they would be ill brought up by Thérèse's family, whom he despised, particularly her mother.
So he concluded the risk of neglect was much less in the hospital system.
In the well-funded, though often lethal, Foundling Hospital system, yes.
That is an astonishing rationalization. He essentially chose a highly impersonal institutional system over the messy reality of his own family, believing the institution would somehow preserve their innocence better than he could.
It says so much about his priorities. Abstract morality and the avoidance of personal inconvenience trumped paternal duty. And his critics, most famously Voltaire, seized on this abandonment as the ultimate ad hominem attack when his ideas on morality and education became famous.
It created an enormous, impossible biographical shadow, the foundational lie, that makes his subsequent ascent as a moral philosopher feel, almost absurd.
It certainly makes the next phase of his life, his philosophical breakthrough, feel less like genuine insight and maybe more like an act of profound, world-altering compensation.
Okay, so let's talk about that breakthrough. It arrived not in a calm study, but literally on the road. In 1749, Rousseau was walking to visit his friend Diderot.
who was imprisoned in Vincennes for publishing radical materialistic views.
Right. And while walking, he saw the announcer for the Académie de Dijon essay competition.
And the question was, has the rebirth of the arts and sciences contributed to the purification of the morals? Rousseau claimed to have a revelation, a mental flash that was so intense he had to stop walking and weep beneath a tree. He described seeing another universe and became a different man.
And the revelation was simple. No.
Just no. His winning 1750 essay, The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, argued that the advancement of civilization of arts and sciences was not a sign of progress, but the primary cause of humanity's moral degeneration. He argued that man in his natural state was fundamentally good.
This was a direct shot across the bow of the mainstream Enlightenment, which was all about celebrating progress and reason.
Absolutely. And Rousseau built his subsequent political philosophy, The Discourse on Inequality, by directly challenging existing contract theory, especially Hobbes.
And Hobbes had argued that life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, because man, without an overarching sovereign, was inherently wicked and motivated by self-interest.
Rousseau fundamentally disagreed. He criticized Hobbes for assuming that man in the state of nature was already corrupted because he lacked an idea of goodness or law. Rousseau countered that the true savage had no moral relations with or determinate obligations to one another. They just existed, isolated, well-fed, and untroubled by conflict or property.
So to make that argument, he had to define the natural self. What were the core, uncorrupted elements?
He identified two fundamental pre-rational, pre-social traits, which he said we share with animals, that pointed toward natural goodness. The first is amour de soi, simply the instinct for self-preservation, caring for oneself.
Okay.
The second is pitié, natural pity, or empathy for the suffering of others within one's species, and these proceed and operate independently of reason or sociability.
These sound pretty benign. So where does the corruption, the wickedness that Hobbes observed, where does that come from?
It comes from society. Rousseau introduced the concept of amour propre, or vanity, which is the corrupted social form of amour de soi.
Okay, so break that down.
Amour de soi is natural self-love. Amour propre is competitive, comparative self-love. It only arises when humans begin to care intensely about their relative status to others, to be recognized, admired, or feared.
This is where it gets really interesting, especially for us today. That competitive, comparative self-love, amour propre, that is the root of so much modern anxiety. It's what drives social media status wars, consumerism, and keeping up with the Joneses.
Precisely. Rousseau identified the exact psychological moment we stop looking inward and start constantly looking outward to measure ourselves against others. It is a psychological engine that transforms sufficiency into a perpetual craving.
And what enables this transformation?
Rousseau argued it was humanity's unique, double-edged ability, perfectibility.
Perfectibility, the capacity for improvement. That sounds like a good thing on the surface.
Well, it is the defining human trait. It is the capacity to improve one's condition, both individually and collectively, through free choice. It is what allows for history, technology, and collective change. But, and this is the key, Rousseau warned that this capacity offers no guarantee that the evolution will be for the better.
Give us an example of that double edge.
Okay, think about the invention of tools. Perfectibility allows us to invent a plow, which leads to agriculture, stable food supplies, and larger communities. That's evolution for the better. But the exact same capacity allows us to invent a sword, which leads to warfare, conquest, and slavery. Perfectibility is just the engine of change. The direction is determined by our political choices and the influence of amour propre.
And this leads directly to the mechanism by which society cemented inequality, private property. This is maybe his most quoted and most radical philosophical moment.
It is the iconic turning point, vividly described in the Discourse on Inequality. Rousseau imagines the founder of civil society. The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him that man was the true founder of civil society.
The implication is just brutal. Civil society is founded on a hoax, a lie that everyone, through their laziness or naivety, agrees to participate in.
Yes. He suggested that someone could have saved mankind from countless horrors just by pulling up those stakes and reminding everyone that the earth belongs to nobody. But they didn't. As humans moved from nomadic hunting to settled life, agriculture and metallurgy necessitated permanent settlement and, crucially, the formalization of property.
This was a choice, he says, not a natural law, and it instantly led to economic disparity.
And that proximity led to the critical psychological shift you mentioned earlier. When you're living close together, people inevitably begin comparing resources, beauty, and strength. They started valuing the opinions of others, resulting in esteem, envy, and fixed social hierarchies. This competitive comparison, driven by amour propre, became the core illness of society.
There's that chilling observation he makes.
The savage lives within himself. Sociable man, always outside himself, can only live in the opinion of others.
Wow. Living always outside himself is the definition of alienation. And Rousseau argues that the political systems that followed, monarchies, aristocracies, even early democracies, were essentially just tools used by the wealthy, the property owners, to solidify this initial injustice.
The political system, according to Rousseau, was the hoax the rich perpetrated to protect their ill-gotten gains and establish laws that benefited only them. But this conclusion provides his theoretical starting point for Part 3. If our problems are the product of corrupt political choices, they can, theoretically, be fixed by a truly legitimate political system.
This devastating critique of existing society sets the stage for his revolutionary solution, detailed in the Social Contract, or Principles of Political Right, published in 1762. This was looking for nothing less than the basis for a legitimate political order.
It influenced modern republicanism and political philosophy forever. Rousseau begins with his famous declaration, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains."
Right. And the central problem he's trying to solve is how individuals can join civil society, giving up their absolute natural freedom, yet preserve themselves and remain fundamentally free. How does he square that circle? It sounds like doublespeak.
He argues that the individual submits not to a sovereign king like Hobbes suggested, but to the collective body, to the community itself. Individuals must totally alienate all their rights to the whole community. This total surrender, paradoxically, ensures freedom because individuals collectively are the authors of the law. They obey themselves. There's no external master.
So if everyone gives up everything to the collective, no single person gains power over another. It's an enforced equality of submission that results in collective liberty.
Precisely. And this leads us to the trickiest, most defining concept of his work, the general will, or volonté générale. This is so often misunderstood and misinterpreted.
So this is the collective will of society as a whole.
Yes, and it's specifically designed to transcend private, sectional, or selfish interests.
The critique often confuses the general will with the will of all. Can you clarify the difference? Because that distinction is everything.
It is absolutely crucial. The will of all, volonté de tous, is simply the aggregation of every private individual desire, what the majority selfishly wants. If everyone votes for a tax break that only benefits their neighborhood, that's the will of all.
Okay.
The general will, however, is what results when citizens actively deliberate, stripping away those selfish interests and asking, what is best for the common good of the entire state?
So it's not about the number of votes. It's about the quality and intent behind the decision. It demands that citizens think ethically and civically, not just personally.
Correct. It demands a level of civic virtue that Rousseau himself admitted was incredibly difficult to achieve. And this brings up a profound point he made in the Discourse on Political Economy. The purpose of the general will is explicitly to protect the individual against the mass, not to require the individual to be sacrificed to the collective.
That's a really important clarification.
It is. When the general will is functioning correctly, the common interest is the protection of every individual citizen.
But if people are driven by amour propre, how can we guarantee they will vote for the common good rather than their personal interest? This sounds completely utopian. How does Rousseau propose we actually identify and enforce the general will?
This is where Rousseau introduces two restrictive ideas. First, he emphasizes that the general will requires active, direct involvement, discussion, and voting by every citizen. He really favored the small city-state model, like Geneva, over large nations like France, where representation would just corrupt the process.
He rejected representative democracy entirely. He believed that sovereignty can't be represented, it has to be exercised directly.
Yes. He saw the English as being free only during the time they elected their parliament and then becoming enslaved once the election was over.
So what's the second idea?
Second, and maybe more controversially, he introduces the figure of the legislator. Since individuals are naturally short-sighted and driven by self-interest, they need a mythical, non-governing figure, a sort of divine guide like Lycurgus of Sparta or Moses, to shape the desires of the people and teach them the common good before they can truly formulate the general will.
A non-governing moral architect. That's fascinating. It suggests that the people have to be fundamentally re-educated, taught to abandon amour propre before the social contract can even function.
Exactly. The legislator is required to essentially mold citizens into a homogeneous body capable of pursuing virtue. And this leads to his argument that true Republican health requires economic stability and homogeneity, a place without massive wealth disparity or competing factions.
Which flows naturally into his economic views, his critique of luxury and finance.
Rousseau offered a trenchant critique of modern wealth, luxury, and complex financial systems. His ideas strongly align with agrarianism and autarchism, or national self-sufficiency. He believed excessive wealth inevitably corrupts the body politic by creating dependencies and fueling amour propre.
Because if citizens are preoccupied with accumulating luxury goods or competing for status, they're going to vote according to their private selfish interests, the will of all, rather than the common good.
That's the link. Later scholars argued he wasn't rejecting commerce outright, but seeking to tame utility, self-love, and even trade to serve the health of the republic. If trade introduces corrupting luxuries, then it must be constrained. The focus has to be on maintaining basic equality and civic virtue.
So his entire political theory is incredibly demanding. It demands civic virtue, direct participation, social homogeneity, and a rejection of the luxury and complexity that, define the modern state. In the same year, 1762, he publishes The Social Contract and his treatise on education, Emile. It's almost impossible to discuss Emile without returning to that personal shadow. The man who abandoned his 5 children became the prophet of modern education.
It remains the most jarring paradox. Some historians suggest Emile might have been Rousseau's attempt to conceptualize the perfect child-rearing system he felt he lacked the resources or virtue to execute himself.
So it's an idealized fantasy, maybe an act of philosophical compensation.
It could be. Regardless, his influence is monumental.
What was the core goal of Emile?
The goal was not to impart specific information, facts, or dogma. It was to develop the pupil's character and moral sense so they could practice self-mastery and function as a virtuous, self-reliant individual within an imperfect society. The child has to be sheltered from the corrupting influence of society for as long as possible.
He structures the entire education process around developmental stages, doesn't he?
Yes, he was a revolutionary developmental theorist. The first stage, age 112, is purely guided by emotions and impulses. The child should be allowed to run free and discover the world with minimal interference. The second, age 12-16, is when reason begins to develop and instruction can begin, focused on utility and science.
And then finally, age 16 and up is the moral and social development into an adult capable of love and civic duty.
Exactly. And he pioneered specific, highly influential pedagogical methods.
The primary one being natural consequences.
Right. He argued against physical punishment. Instead, if a child breaks a window, they experience the consequence, the cold air, the discomfort, and learn the natural law of cause and effect. The tutor's role is just to arrange the environment to ensure the child experiences the consequence of their own acts without coming to any lasting harm.
He also insisted on practical skills. Emile, the student, has to learn a manual trade, like carpentry.
This was not just to foster creativity, but critically, to provide a fallback means of making an honest, independent living in case of a political or financial collapse. This speaks directly to his anti-luxury agrarian philosophy.
It's a powerful statement of Republican self-reliance, and the legacy is immense. His ideas influenced nearly all major progressive educators: Pestalozzi, Maria Montessori, John Dewey.
And on a cultural level, his encouragement for mothers to abandon the practice of using wet nurses and to breastfeed their own children became a popular movement that reshaped family life among the European aristocracy and bourgeoisie.
That one biological detail fundamentally changed the European household and earned him immense praise from contemporaries who celebrated him for teaching us to be mothers.
The irony, of course, being that this praise for his moral influence ran concurrently with his massive theoretical failures concerning women and religion.
Okay, let's turn to Sophie. The idealized woman Emile is destined to marry. This is where Rousseau's revolutionary ideas just break down into traditional, almost repressive views.
It is a profound, jarring inconsistency. While Emile is educated for self-governance and independence, Sophie, the woman, is educated specifically to be dependent upon and governed by her husband. Rousseau argued that women must be confined to the domestic sphere and educated primarily to please and serve men.
Why this sharp contradiction?
He believed that women possessed an inherent power to manipulate men through sexuality and affection. And if they weren't constrained by modesty and shame, men would become tyrannized by women. He saw the subordination of women in the private sphere as essential for the political virtue of men in the public sphere to function correctly.
And this earned him sharp, lasting criticism from figures like Mary Wollstonecraft, who was already building her case for the rights of women.
Absolutely. Wollstonecraft's later critique was focused squarely on Rousseau's prescription for Sophie. She argued that if men need reason and independence to be good citizens, then women must need the same qualities, not dependence, to be good mothers and partners.
The other major controversy in Emile was theological, the perfection of faith of a Savoyard vicar.
This section was an eloquent defense of natural religious belief, a form of deism or Unitarianism that rejected original sin, the divinity of Christ, and divine revelation. The vicar argued that reason alone is sufficient to prove the existence of God and the moral obligation to follow one's conscience. All religions, insofar as they lead people to virtue, are equally worthy.
Religious indifferentism. In 1762, that was dynamite.
It was. This indifference, the rejection of orthodoxy, caused both Emile and the social contract to be simultaneously condemned and banned in both Calvinist Geneva and Catholic Paris. Warrants were issued for his arrest immediately. He found himself caught between the two great religious powers of the continent.
As David Hume observed, Rousseau has not had the precaution to throw any veil over his sentiments. He really couldn't wonder that all the zealots were in arms against him.
And this forced him into a life of immediate panicked flight.
So that flight began the most paranoid, dramatic, and personally toxic phase of his life. First, the fracture with his intellectual allies, the encyclopedists.
The break with Diderot and Grimm became irreparable. While the encyclopedists were moving rapidly toward materialism and atheism, Rousseau clung fiercely to his belief in the spiritual origin of the soul and the universe, outlined in the Savoyard Vicar.
And this ideological divergence turned into bitter public personal warfare.
It did. Diderot, his former friend, publicly unleashed a torrent of abuse, calling Rousseau false, vain as Satan, ungrateful, cruel, hypocritical, and wicked.
These philosophers, who advocated for reason and tolerance, were engaging in the pettiest, most venomous feuds imaginable.
And Rousseau, already convinced the world was conspiring against him, became the perfect target. While he was a fugitive in Switzerland, Voltaire, his longtime rival, issued a cynical public invitation for him to stay, knowing full well Rousseau would never accept charity. Meanwhile, D'Alembert advised him to seek asylum under Frederick the Great of Prussia.
Which is strange, considering Rousseau had criticized Frederick in his earlier work.
It was a calculated risk. Rousseau wrote to Frederick seeking protection. Frederick, ever the enlightened despot, responded with cutting sarcasm, calling Rousseau a poor unfortunate whose only fault was having strange opinions. He noted that Rousseau's morals were pure, but his mind was illogical. He granted protection, but treated Rousseau as a strange, wild curiosity.
Then came the famous literary scandal that drove Rousseau to the edge. The Horace Walpole hoax.
Walpole, a celebrated man of letters and a friend of Hume, wrote a devastatingly satirical fake letter pretending to be Frederick the Great, and arranged for it to be published in Grimm's influential periodical. The whole joke was that Rousseau was seeking persecution, so Frederick was happy to oblige.
What did the fake letter actually say?
It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. The letter offered Rousseau royal protection, but then concluded with the ultimate insult. If you persist in racking your brains to find new misfortunes, choose such as you may desire. I am king and can procure any to suit your wishes. I shall cease to persecute you when you cease to find your glory in being persecuted.
It framed Rousseau as a vain drama queen, feeding off his own perceived martyrdom. And this prank, which spread like wildfire across Europe, was a major catalyst for his final, most public dispute.
The spectacular quarrel with David Hume.
Right. So Rousseau eventually traveled to London in 1766 under the protection of David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, and he was celebrated wildly by the English public, who saw him as this romantic, persecuted figure.
There's a great story about him at one royal performance where Rousseau, unaccustomed to such attention, became so flustered that he nearly fell out of his box. Hume observed that the king and queen were watching Rousseau more closely than the actual performance.
But the paranoia, fueled by the Frederick hoax, was already taking root.
It just exploded. Rousseau became convinced that Hume was the ringleader of a vast conspiracy to ruin him. His suspicions were compounded by a few circumstantial facts. The Frederick hoax was published in a paper run by Hume's friend, and Rousseau learned that Hume was lodging with the son of his Genevan enemy.
He started writing these furious, rambling letters to Hume. I understand one of them was 18 pages long, just detailing his resentment and perceived betrayal.
Yes. Hume, who was initially kind and protective, concluded that Rousseau was suffering a mental breakdown. Hume was urged by d'Alembert and other Parisian intellectuals to publish his side of the story, to set the record straight before Rousseau's paranoia completely consumed the narrative.
And when Hume published his account of the quarrel, the public fallout was immense.
It became an international source of amusement, resonating in Geneva, Amsterdam, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. Diderot, watching the two intellectual giants squabble in public, called the entire mess tragic. While Hume's reputation remained largely intact, Rousseau's eccentricity was solidified in the public mind.
And his flight from England was just as dramatic.
His partner, Thérèse, convinced him to flee by insisting that the servants at the residence in Wootton Hall were seeking to poison him. And Rousseau, completely convinced, returned illegally to France in 1767.
In his final years, despite the continued persecution and wandering, he settled down slightly. He performed a faux civil ceremony with Thérèse in 1768 under the alias Renew.
Right, because they could never legally marry due to his religious history and fugitive status. He spent his final years copying music and working furiously on his confessions, which he didn't want published immediately but used as a defense mechanism. He would give these marathon public group readings to defend his reputation. From slander one session famously lasted 17 hours.
The police eventually had to stop them.
They did, at the request of his former friend, Madame d'Épinay, who was tired of being implicated in his drama.
It's often forgotten that he was also a composer. His one-act opera, The Village Soothsayer, was moderately successful and even later arranged by Beethoven.
And his contribution to the Chorale des Buffons was significant. Arguing for Italian music's simple melody over French music's rigid harmony, he was advocating for free expression and the natural voice over rigid rules, a profound foreshadowing of the Romantic movement. He also composed acclaimed scientific works, the Letters on the Elements of Botany, which Goethe praised as a true pedagogical model.
He died in 1778, possibly due to cerebral bleeding following an accident 2 years earlier where a carriage, flanked by a Great Dane, knocked him down in Paris, his final ironic destination. His remains were moved to the Pantheon in 1794 to lie near his great rival Voltaire,
where, as one commentator noted, their spirits could continue to renew their war for the soul of the revolution.
The influence of Rousseau on global politics was immediate and cataclysmic, particularly fueling the French Revolution. His writings provided the philosophical language for the radical Jacobins, including Robespierre and Saint-Just.
Robespierre was a devoted follower. He derived his justification for the common good and the collective will directly from Rousseau's general will. The Jacobins believed they were acting as the embodiment of this pure collective virtue, even when using violence.
And his religious ideas played a role too.
Absolutely. Rousseau's democratic pantheistic deism from the Savoyard vicar was directly invoked during the ceremonies for the new Republican Constitution, specifically in the cult of the Supreme Being. The revolutionaries needed a moral foundation that wasn't Christianity, and Rousseau provided it, a civic religion based on reason and natural goodness.
Across the Atlantic, while direct influence is sometimes debated, you see parallels everywhere. Noah Webster, 2 years before the Constitutional Convention, heavily relied on the social contract while arguing for a strong central government.
You can see echoes in the U.S. Constitution's General Welfare Clause, which aligns conceptually with the general will.
And his praise for civic militias, agrarian economies, and the small independent homesteads, like those he admired in Switzerland and Corsica, that certainly resonated strongly with Thomas Jefferson and the spirit of early American democracy.
But perhaps his most pervasive and less political influence was on the Romantic movement, changing how Europeans perceived nature, emotion, and the self. His sentimental novel, Julie, or The New Heloise, became a sensation. Its focus on intense, individualized feeling and rhapsodic descriptions of the natural beauty of the Swiss countryside was crucial to the development of pre-Romanticism.
It was a massive cultural shift. The Enlightenment had focused on reason, structure, and universal laws. Rousseau shifted the focus to feeling, natural morality, and the individual's unique experience.
Writers and artists across Europe, Goethe, Schiller, Wordsworth, were profoundly influenced by his emphasis on individualism and the moral superiority of nature. Leo Tolstoy, a lifelong admirer, admitted that as a teenager, he wore a medallion of Rousseau instead of a cross.
So Rousseau's works gave the Romantic movement its foundational language for self-expression and the sublime power of uncorrupted nature.
Exactly. Yet from the moment he achieved fame, he faced severe, cutting critiques. Not just from Voltaire, who found his primitivism ridiculous and famously implied Rousseau wanted humanity to return to walking on all fours.
Samuel Johnson offered a more personal condemnation, calling him one of the worst of men, a rascal who ought to be hunted out of society.
And Edmund Burke, the early conservative theorist, linked Rousseau's philosophy directly to his egoistic philosophy and his personal vanity, arguing that the philosophy of the self was destined to lead to political chaos.
This political critique intensified dramatically during the 20th century with the totalitarian thesis. Critics, particularly during the Cold War, associated Rousseau's ideas with Jacobinism, nationalism, and the origins of modern totalitarianism.
Thinkers like Jacob Talmon in The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy argued that Rousseau's insistence on the absolute unity and moral infallibility of the general will laid the groundwork for political systems that could not tolerate dissent.
Because if the general will is always morally correct, that anyone who disagrees must be selfishly pursuing the will of all. This means dissenters are not merely wrong, they are morally deficient enemies of the state.
Exactly. Hannah Arendt took this argument further, suggesting that Rousseau's profound personal desire for a single, unified identity to overcome his individual amour propre was translated into a political desire for a single, unified general will that crushed all individual differences in favor of public passion. She saw this as the ideological precursor to the excesses of the Terror.
Then there is the economic critique, focusing on his views of natural order. Frédéric Bastiat, the great French classical liberal economist, criticized Rousseau for viewing people as a thoughtless mass to be shaped by philosophers.
Bastiat, a proponent of the concept of spontaneous order, refuted Rousseau's premise that social order requires central direction or philosophical engineering. He argued that complex social order arises naturally and spontaneously through independent economic exchange without requiring external guidance or a legislator.
He used that classic example to illustrate this spontaneous order, right? The clothing.
The reduction of clothing, yes. Think about the sheer number of independent parties involved. The farmer who grows the wool, the shearer, the transporter, the weaver, the tailor, the financier. None of these people know each other, yet they cooperate and fulfill each other's needs through basic economic laws and self-interest, creating a complex social structure naturally.
So Bastiat argued that Rousseau misread human nature by demanding a philosopher direct it back to a natural state when a superior, spontaneous order already exists in independent exchange.
That's the core of the critique.
So what does this all mean for us today? We have a man whose life was defined by chaos, who abandoned his own children, was consumed by paranoia, and yet gifted the world the language of popular sovereignty, educational reform, and the primacy of the feeling self.
We've seen that Rousseau transformed philosophy by shifting the center of gravity from abstract reason to feeling and natural morality. He provided the necessary ideological tools for mass political action, revolution, and the romantic appreciation of nature. He remains urgently relevant through his controversial but vital views on property, education, and the pathology of vanity.
Rousseau believed humanity's unique capacity for perfectibility meant that collective change for the better was possible. But he also recognized this evolution has no guarantee.
And that leads to the final provocative question that we leave you with. Rousseau's revolutionary call for the general will was intended, as some commentators suggest, to protect the individual from the mass and tame society's corruption.
Yet his rigorous demands for civic virtue, political homogeneity, and the subordination of private interests were almost immediately co-opted to justify the purges and excesses of the French Terror.
So does this prove that the flaw lies not in the theory of the general will itself, but in humanity's persistent, perhaps incurable inability to overcome that self-obsessed, status-driven vanity and truly submit to the common good? It's a question that challenges the very foundation of democratic idealism.